So for this trip, they booked 3 rooms, one for the daughter-in-law, one for the father-in-law, and one for the mother-in-law to sleep in the room with her son, Mr. Kim. Hello, friends and family. This is Megan Moon, aka 저는 미국 사람입니다. As you can hear in my voice, I am sick, okay? My nose was so stuffy last night that I could not breathe out of it at all, and I had to breathe out of my mouth, and I am not a mouth breather by any stretch of the imagination, so I got like 0 sleep last night. I am dead, but I am here to share these stories with you. Last week I made a video talking about why marriage in Korea is difficult, and I talked about a lot of the psychological aspects behind it, and one of the main reasons why it's difficult is because of in-laws, mom-in-laws. And while doing the research for that video, I came across a bunch of crazy mom-in-law stories. So I asked you guys in the last video if you wanted me to share some of those with you. You guys were like, yes, 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 please share. So that's what we're doing today. So I do want to preface by saying the intention of this video is not to make fun of these people or to talk bad about Korean mom-in-laws, because I do feel bad for them because the older generation is very much a product of that culture at that time. And I do think that in cultures like this where husband and wife don't really have good quality marriages, it's very easy for the women to just latch on to their sons, which is what happens a lot. So when you think about it, it's sort of like a way for them to get and receive love. So I totally understand the psychology behind that, and I feel for these people. However, it doesn't mean that we can't enjoy listening to the drama and hearing the tea about these stories, because they're very interesting. Today I'm going to share 2 stories from JTBC News. JTBC News has a segment on it called 사건 반장 별별 상담소. And on that show, people send in their stories. There's a couple of news announcers sharing their opinion. They always have therapists to sort of share their opinion about the psychology and or if it's grounds for divorce, etc. It's a really interesting show. Last month, one came out and it blew up. It's got like 1.2 million views and like over 3,000 comments. We're gonna go over that one second. So this first story, the person who sent in this story, the news announcers just called her Mrs. Kim, and her future husband, boyfriend, let's just call him Mr. Kim. So Mr. and Mrs. Kim, and then mom-in-law and father-in-law, I'll just call them mom and father-in-law. So Mrs. Kim met her boyfriend. They seemed to hit it off really well. After about 6 months, they decided that they wanted to move toward marriage. So Mr. Kim called up his parents, set up a meeting between Mrs. Kim and the parents. You know, in Korea, people typically get permission to get married. So it's always necessary that you set up a meeting with the parents, and the parents have to approve of the person before any marriages can take place. So the first time Mrs. Kim met the parents, they met at a shrimp restaurant. And I don't know what it is, but I think Korean men really like to remove the shells from the shrimp for their ladies. In Korea, when you go get shrimp at restaurants, especially grilled shrimp, it's almost always gonna have the shells and everything and all the little legs and like the head and like the little antennas. Everything is intact. It's a fully intact shrimp. And Mr. Moon does this for me too. Like whenever we go out and have shrimp, even to this day, we have shrimp at home, he's always gonna peel my shrimp for me. I thought it was a Mr. Moon thing, but I've heard so many stories of other men peeling shrimp for women. I guess it's a thing in Korea. Men peel the shrimp for you, which is great because they look like little nasty bugs to me, and I personally don't like touching the little leg. So thank you, Mr. Moon. So Mr. Kim and Mrs. Kim are sat before mother and father-in-law. The shrimp comes out. Mr. Kim starts peeling the shrimp, and he gives it to Mrs. Kim, his girlfriend at the time. Mom-in-law looks. 엄마부터 안 챙기고 여자친구부터 챙겼냐? So you're not gonna get your mom shrimp first? You're gonna get your girlfriend shrimp first? So Mrs. Kim feels a little bit uncomfortable, like, okay, what is this? But nobody really says anything. They just kind of gloss over it. And apparently everything else was fine after that because Mrs. Kim went on to marry Mr. Kim. So when they first got married, the mom-in-law would come to the house often, like several times a week, to bring over, you know, side dishes and food for her son. But one day she came over and she brought her son some underwear that she bought. And she says to the daughter-in-law, 내 아들 속옷 사이즈 네가 어떻게 알겠냐? How can you know my son's underwear size? Like, you don't know his underwear size. 내 아들 속옷 취향 내가 잘 알아. I know the type of underwear that my son likes. And then she goes on to say, 앞으로 속옷 내가 사겠다. I'm going to buy his underwear from now on. Mrs. Kim is like, excuse me? And here she sort of shared that she was worried that she's just being too sensitive. Like, am I just being too sensitive? Is this something that's appropriate? Do all moms continue to buy their adult 30-something-year-old sons, even after marriage, underwear? So she just kind of let it go and whatever. They didn't want to cause a fight. So one day shortly after, Mr. and Mrs. Kim went to mother and father-in-law's house to have a meal. There's a bunch of side dishes. One of my favorite side dishes is kusari, which is like fern break. And then it just has a little bit of soy sauce and sesame oil on it, a little bit of sesame seeds. And mom-in-law made something called 갈비찜, which is braised short ribs in like a sweet soy sauce. It's really good. So when you go to your mother-in-law's house and she's in the kitchen cooking, you're supposed to go in and ask if she needs any help. So Mrs. Kim goes into her mom's kitchen. Hey, do you need some help? And she goes to pick up something to start helping. Mom-in-law smacks the hand. 내 아들 먹는 건 내가 할 거야. I'm going to be cooking the food that my son eats. So the daughter-in-law didn't do anything. She just kind of sat around, and then the table was set. There's all these side dishes, so delicious. Everything smells good. So the mom-in-law takes her chopsticks, picks up a piece of the braised short ribs, and puts it up to her son and says, 아들아, 갈비찜 좀 먹을래? My son, do you want to have some braised short ribs? And to the daughter-in-law, she picks up her chopsticks and picks up some kusari, which is fern break, that like brown stem-looking thing that you see in the bibimbap. 마누라, 고사리 간 좀 봐봐. You might be like, okay, well, she's offering the daughter-in-law some food, like what's the big deal? But how it is she's saying this good thing, this meat is going to be for my son, and you, the daughter-in-law, you just have the vegetables, right? No matter how good these vegetables are, obviously we know the meat, that is the sustenance, right? The meat and potatoes is what we say even as a colloquial expression in English, right? Like the main sustenance of the meal. And basically she's saying, I'm going to give my son these good things and you just take whatever. Mrs. Kim said this is the first time she seriously considered divorce because her husband didn't say anything. Like you would expect he would say, oh, my wife likes 갈비찜 too, or she can have 갈비찜 or whatever. But he didn't say anything. But Mrs. Kim felt like very just disrespected. Like, why is this woman coming for me like this? So then not too long after, the father-in-law was like, hey, why don't we all travel together? Let's go on a trip. Mr. and Mrs. Kim, mother and father-in-law. Like, what could go wrong? We would all bond and it would be a great trip, right? The problem started right from even reserving the accommodations for the trip. If you were going on a trip with your in-laws, you would expect that we would reserve 2 rooms, one for Mr. and Mrs. Kim and one for mother and father-in-law. But mom-in-law comes out and says, you know what? I want to sleep in the room with my son. So how about we all get one big room and we all sleep in one big room together? This is like one of the times where the son spoke up. He was like, it'd probably be uncomfortable if we're all sharing one big room. Like, let's have our separate space. 그럼 오랜만에 아들이랑 자겠다. I'm going to sleep in the room with my son. It's been a long time since we've done that. And she says to the daughter-in-law, 너는 다른 방에서 편하게 자라. You just go sleep in another room and be comfortable. So for this trip, they booked 3 rooms, one for the daughter-in-law, one for the father-in-law, and one for the mother-in-law to sleep in a room with her son, Mr. Kim. The whole time I'm just thinking, where is the father-in-law? Like the father-in-law should say, hey, honey, maybe that's a bit much. You're going to sleep in the room with me, and they're going to sleep in the room together. But the father-in-law's like, well, what is he doing? So they booked the accommodations that way, and Mrs. Kim was sort of complaining to her husband, like, hey, what's going on? And he was like, 엄마랑 잘래. 엄마가 외로워서 그래. I'm going to sleep with my mom. She's just lonely. That's why, she wants to sleep with me. But it's like, she has a husband. He's not dead. Even if her husband was dead and she was a widow, still, that would be just not even appropriate, right? It's like, okay, your husband died. Find some friends. I don't know. Definitely don't be trying to sleep in a room with your son. Sometimes when these stories are on, I'm like watching them like with Mr. Moon, and I'd be like, sir, if she as a mom-in-law ever, we will be done because I could never, ever. But apparently this is a thing. In the last video, I mentioned this monk who's really popular on YouTube, Pumnun Sunnim. He has like millions of subscribers, and people call into him and like say their concerns and he gives them advice. Like 2 years ago, there was a story on there, and this widow mom-in-law lived with her son and his wife in a 1-room apartment, and there was just like a curtain that blocked it off. And the mom-in-law wants to sleep with the son, so the wife has just been sleeping on the couch, and mom-in-law and son-in-law have been sleeping like sort of out of the way behind the curtain. And she was married to this man for 25 years. I cannot. Anyway, but I've heard many stories of like mom-in-laws wanting to like sleep like next to their sons and stuff. It's not common. I don't want people in here to think that I'm saying that it's super common, but I've just heard a lot of stories and like of stuff like that happening. So there are some people who do that, but it's definitely not the most common thing. But back to the story. So I said, what is the father-in-law doing? Like, why isn't he saying, wife, get it together? Apparently, he's just going along with whatever she wants, because when they were on that trip together, which they did actually go on, if it was me, I would have said, well, I'm not going on a trip. Why don't you just go with your mom by yourself? Because apparently that's what she wants. And I don't know. I probably would have gotten a divorce already. But in the story, she didn't say where they went, but I'm going to say they went to Jeju. So they're in Jeju-do. It's beautiful, beautiful scenery. And the mom's like, why don't we all take a picture? So the father-in-law's like, okay, I'll take the picture of everyone. Mom-in-law goes, grabs her son's arm, sort of nudges the wife, Mrs. Kim, away. And she says, 엄마랑 먼저 사진 찍어야지. You gotta take a picture with your mom first. Like, she comes after me. And Mrs. Kim shared in her story that at this point, she felt like she's the second wife to Mr. Kim. Right? The first wife is the mom. The second wife is her. And she's like, I cannot stay in this situation much longer. She didn't last very long. She got a divorce after a year. But even still, that's longer than I would have lasted. There are some people in stories I've heard from divorce lawyers where people in these situations, literally like 2-3 months later, they're like, I'm out. So at this point in the story, she shares that Mr. Kim also has a younger sister. Up until this point, you thought that Mr. Kim was maybe an only child, but no, there's a younger sister, and apparently the younger sister left the house because the mom shared so much favoritism toward the son. And it's so sad. This daughter said that she never felt any type of love or warmth from her mom at all. So as soon as she could, she started working and left the house. And like, how sad is that, to not feel any love for your mom and see your mom fawning over, you know, your brother like that? Like, I can't imagine what kind of big impact it would have on her. But at least she was somebody who was like, you know what, I'm gonna get out and take control of my own life and live. Because I've heard that there are people who go opposite and like bend over backwards to try and please their parents instead. So good on her for getting out. Anyway, the trip to Jeju-do is over. Everyone's back at home. A couple days later, after coming back from Jeju-do, Mrs. Kim is at home getting some cleaning done. Ding dong, doorbell rings. She goes and gets it. It's a package. She opens it up. It's some couple clothes. It's like a sweatpants, like sweatshirt and sweatpants couple set. There's like a man's size and a woman's size in there. So she's thinking, because of that trip that didn't go so well, maybe mom-in-law is just trying to make amends and send them some couple clothes that they can wear. Bring, bring. Mom-in-law calls. 여보세요. couple 옷 집에 도착했지? The couple clothes arrived all right, right? 그 옷 나랑 내 아들이랑 다음번 여행할 때 입으려고 산 거거든? Mrs. Kim is like, what? You just ordered some couple clothes that you want to wear with your son-in-law for the next time we go on a trip? The mom-in-law goes on to say that she had him sent to the house so her son could try it on to make sure it fits so that she can get a different size if she needed later on. It was at this point in time that Miss Kim decided to divorce. I don't blame her. Everyone in the comments was like, divorce, divorce, divorce. One thing that a lot of people are saying nowadays, and I think a lot of people are feeling, is that mainly it's up to the husband to sort of set those boundaries. Like, the older generation is sort of set in their ways and are a product of their ways. And mother-in-law's husband, father-in-law, definitely should have been blocking that from a while ago, but maybe her personality is just strong and people just don't want to fight with her, and they think it's easier to just give her what she wants instead of going against it, because maybe she throws a big tantrum. But definitely, one thing I said in the last video, all Korean mom-in-laws are not like this, where they're like really trying to treat your husband like their husband, but they inevitably will do things that you feel like cross the line. So you have to make sure that you have a partner who's willing to speak up and set those boundaries really strongly, like Mr. Moon does. Otherwise, it would be very difficult. And also, you have to be someone who's willing to speak up for what you feel uncomfortable with and what you will and will not tolerate. It's not for the faint of heart. If you're somebody who's a people pleaser and you're married here and you have in-laws that are like very traditional, it could be very difficult to you. Just a forewarning. So this next story I actually found this morning. I was gonna do another story, but I found this one. It popped up immediately because it's been one of the most viral ones that they've had. And the person who sent in the story to JTBC News is also a Mrs. Kim. So we will be calling Mr. and Mrs. Kim and mother and father-in-law once again. So Mrs. Kim is around 35 years old. She met an amazing man, figured that they should get married. So on the first meeting she had with her mother-in-law addressed her like, "Ya, no," which is very disrespectful language. When you're first meeting people in Korea, there's different types of language that you use. There's like a very respectful language where you're saying things and you're putting yo at the end. There's also something called very high language where you may use 입니다 and you use a completely different set of words for stuff. For example, house is 집, but when you're being a respectful tone, you will say 댁. So the words are different. I'm assuming many of you guys maybe know basic level of Korean, but eat, 먹다, for an older person, you use a word like 드시다. Like it's just a totally different language. So you have to learn extra words for stuff to address old people. Like it's that serious, like rankings and who's older and who's not. Now, when you meet an older person, they can talk to you in 반말 right away. It really irritates me because old people sometimes show such a huge lack of respect for anybody. And so it really irritates me when you meet someone for the very first time, older or not, and they speak 반말 in like informal language. I guess I've been in Korea too long. I expect to be respected in the amount of respect that I give to you. So it's not typical for a respectful old person. Even if they meet someone younger, they typically will use a bit of formal language. They'll end everything with yo. Right? Because they don't know you still, right? Maybe after you met a couple times, then maybe they'll switch to informal language because they're older, they can make that decision. But when you first meet someone, especially not the person who's going to be marrying your son, you definitely wouldn't be like, yeah, no. No means you. Yeah is just like, hey. Like that's completely disrespectful. I don't even talk to Moon like that. Like we don't even talk to each other like that. So her mom-in-law was addressing her in that way, just very, very informally and disrespectfully. But she thought, maybe that's just how my future mother-in-law is. Whatever. For whatever reason, she proceeded to go along with the marriage. When Mr. and Mrs. Kim decided to get married, they decided not to get any help from either side of the family. And they also decided that they weren't going to exchange gifts. There's something called 예물 and 예단, which are gifts that either side sort of exchanges for themselves. Sometimes it could be a huge amount of money or just like very, very expensive gifts. Like I'm talking in the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of money that you exchange between families for this marriage to happen. Nowadays, people don't do that. I didn't do that. It's outdated, but there's still a lot of older people who want to do it and think it's necessary. Nowadays, when people get married, they typically, up until marriage, the parents support you, even get you a house like to live in after marriage. But in a case where your parents are paying for your marriage, paying for your house after marriage, you know that they're going to be intruding and breaking all the boundaries because they feel entitled to do so because they are the ones who set up this marriage for you. So a lot of younger people are like, they don't want to accept money or anything from their parents because they feel less entitled to sort of intrude in that marriage. So it's very admirable that the couple got married without any help from their families. So they go through with the marriage. After the marriage, mom-in-law calls up daughter-in-law. Bring, bring. 야, 너 정말 해도 너무한다. Like, aren't you're doing the most, basically. 어떻게 우리 아들 15원 한 장 안 내면서 데려갈 수가 있냐? How could you not even pay even just a penny to take my son and live with him? 아들한테 얘기하지 마라. 예단값 1,000,000원 보내라. Don't tell my son, but you need to send me $10,000 for the 예단 price. So the mother-in-law calls her daughter-in-law secretly to demand $10,000. Mrs. Kim didn't want to cause any trouble, so she didn't tell her husband, and she sent her mom-in-law $10,000. Now, I'm saying $10,000. 1,000,000 won is 10 million Korean won. I think it would be maybe like 8,000 US dollars. So let me just clarify that. But she did wind up telling her husband, and the husband asked the mom, and the mom was like, well, I already called the other in-laws, and then, I sent them some stuff too, just without telling you. But even still, that's crazy. Like your son and daughter got married without asking you guys for they just got married. So you're calling up these people and saying, I deserve money because they got married. That is such old school thinking and so disrespectful to go behind your son and daughter's back to like get money from people because they got married on their own. But even still, Mrs. Kim carried on and she got pregnant on their honeymoon. They are having a honeymoon baby. In Korean, the word is honeymoon baby. They have the same word like in English, honeymoon baby. You just say it with a Korean accent, honeymoon baby, and everybody knows what you're talking about. So mom-in-law goes to visit daughter-in-law and she says, hey, even though you're pregnant, you still need to cook my son 3 meals a day. And at night, if you get hungry or have cravings or whatever, don't send him out to like go get you stuff. Like don't bother him with that. Don't go asking him to buy you this and that while you're pregnant. Mrs. Kim didn't say whether or not she followed her mother-in-law's directions. She just moves directly on to a couple days before the birth. So anyway, they're a few days away from the birth. and suddenly there's complications with the birth. Now, Mrs. Kim doesn't tell us exactly what those complications were, but her husband, Mr. Kim, rushed her to the hospital, and at the hospital, the doctor says, you guys need to have an emergency C-section. I guess for whatever reason, probably Mr. Kim called his mom and had her come to the hospital with them. But mother-in-law comes into the hospital and says, you cannot have a C-section. They're literally at the hospital in an emergency situation. The doctor is saying we have to do a C-section, and the mom-in-law is coming in and saying, no, you cannot. Her reasoning is that when you have a natural birth, the baby is smarter and more healthy. So the mom-in-law says, we need to go to another hospital. Well, they will let us do a natural birth. You know, typically in an emergency like this, we want to care more for the mom's health than maybe the possible health of the future baby. I know that that sounds horrible, but typically in hospital situations, they're thinking about the mom's life, right? How do we make sure the mom's life is safe? But it seems like that mom-in-law is only interested in the baby. She's like, I don't care if you're healthy or not, or if it's good for you or not, or whatever emergency you're going through, losing blood or whatever. Okay, you just need to have a natural birth because that's better for the baby. Thankfully, this is one of the times where the husband sort of stood up and said, okay, mom, you need to head out, right? Because this is an emergency. Like, I don't know if the wife could die or whatever. Mrs. Kim didn't say what the issue was, but it's like, okay, you need to go. So he sent the mom out, and they wound up having a C-section and delivering a healthy baby boy. And typically in Korea, when babies are born right away, you don't actually have to have a name and birth certificate. You just do that typically within 1 month of birth. And so we also didn't have a name for one of our kids right at birth either. And another reason why they do that is because a lot of people at birth, when they get the names, they actually go to, a lot of people are superstitious still, so they'll go to monks or other sort of people who do tarot type of things, and they'll go to them and give them the baby's date and time of birth, and then they will go and find a lucky name for them. Like in Korea, a lot of people have superstition around name, like choosing a name determines your future, even to the point where if people go to a fortune teller and they tell them that their current name is not lucky and they need to change their name, they will change their name. Even you guys, I don't know, if you follow me on Instagram, you know, years ago, when I was first training to like do competitions and stuff, my trainer, she actually did that like 2 years ago. She was like, you know, I was told that this name is not lucky and that my son's name is not lucky. So she changed her name and her son's name based on what the fortune teller said. So it's very common for people to not have names for their kids like right at birth. But Mr. and Mrs. Kim decided when they named their kids that they were going to take one syllable from Mr. Kim's name, one syllable from Mrs. Kim's name, put it together, and that was what they were going to name their baby. Typically in Korea, people's names have 2 syllables plus the last name, so 3 syllables total. So that actually sounds like a good idea. I think me and Moon should steal that if we have a third kid. Do you think the mother-in-law liked the name? No, she said, guys, I already went to a monk and I got a name chosen for us. That name is Pak Bong Pai. I've been in Korea for quite some time, so just upon hearing that name, I know that it's a very old people name. It doesn't really fit with current society, and that kid is going to be mocked in school if he has that name. So this is another one of the situations where the couple put their foot down. They were like, okay, no, we are not naming our kid Bong Pai. Okay, we're going to name our kid blah, blah, blah. So the mother-in-law was furious that they weren't going to name their kid 박봉팔. 박봉팔 아니면 집안이 망한다. Very dramatically, she says, if you don't name your kid this, your house is going to fall. Basically, I guess the monk said this is a lucky name for this child, and if this child is not named that, you're going to have bad luck, basically is what she's saying. So that was another big issue that the mom-in-law put up a huge fight with the name, but obviously did not name their kid Bongpai. Nobody who's my age here in Korea would probably name their kid that. So fast forward a little bit later, Mrs. Kim's mom lives in the countryside, and she made a whole bunch of Mrs. Kim's favorite dishes, and Mrs. Kim was out, I believe, at work. Mom-in-law was at the house. And Mrs. Kim's mom came up from the countryside, probably took a couple hours, and she brought a whole bunch of side dishes, and she told Mrs. Kim, her daughter, I brought all these side dishes for you. They'll be waiting for you when you get home. So Mrs. Kim is at work, and she's thinking about her mom's cooking, and she's like, I just can't wait to have my mom's cooking. She gets home, she opens the refrigerator. None of the mom's food that she brought is there. So she asked the mom-in-law, hey, where's the food that my mom brought up from the countryside? 그거 내가 다 버렸어. Oh, I threw all that food away. 재료값 내가 줄 테니까 네가 다시 만들어라. I'm going to give you money so you can go buy the ingredients, but you need to remake that food. Daughter-in-law, Mrs. Kim, was like, excuse me? And a fight ensued. She's like, why would you do that? And the mom-in-law's like, because there was a hair in it. Mrs. Kim is like, well, you can take the hair out. Why would you throw all the food away? Mom-in-law's like, that food is dirty. Then mom-in-law gets really heated because I think this is the first time daughter-in-law really stepped up to her and like gave her a piece of her mind. But mother-in-law starts like pushing her face. You know, when some people are talking, they're all in your face and they're like, hey, I said this. And she's just going off on Mrs. Kim. She's saying, how dare you talk to me like that? Your parents must not have taught you anything. And she's just pushing Mrs. Kim's head right there. So Mrs. Kim, in an effort to get her to stop pushing her head back, sort of does a slapping motion. And she accidentally slaps the mom-in-law in the face, just ever so lightly while she's pushing the hand back. And mom-in-law flips. She hits Mrs. Kim, her daughter-in-law, in the face so hard that her glasses fly off. And she just keeps on hitting her. And then mother-in-law goes into the trash can, gets the food that she threw away, gets food out of the trash can, starts throwing it all around the house. She's legit having the tantrum of her life. And daughter-in-law's not hitting her back or anything. She's just sort of, okay, you know, it was an accident. I didn't mean to punch you in the face. But even still, after she accidentally hit her in the face, mom-in-law proceeds to actually hit her up, like in her face, like actual violence. So then the husband comes home, mom-in-law starts crying, oh, daughter-in-law hit me in the face, like that. And the husband's like, what? How dare you hit my mom? You get on your knees right now and you beg for forgiveness. How dare you do that? And then Mrs. Kim is like, no, sir. So Mr. Kim grabs his mom's hand and proceeds to leave. The people in the comments section were going crazy, like, what? What is wrong, like, with that husband? But even the MC and stuff was like, yeah, this seems like a situation where you wouldn't really be able to get out of. It seems like he's going to continue to just be on the side of his mom for everything. And while I do understand listening to a situation like that where somebody, like, accidentally hit your mom could be jarring for a lot of people in a society where, you know, things are so hierarchical. But the fact that it was overlooked that the mom actually went Rambo on her, but like with a fist instead of a gun, punching everything, and threw food all around the house, that he just lets that go and it's just the wife's fault and only she needs to apologize. Like, everybody was going crazy. This video has over 3,000 comments and people were like, the mom-in-law just needs to live with her son forever. Why would you take someone's precious daughter and cause her so much grief? And it has 3,000 likes. And somebody's like, yeah, a husband like that is not a husband that you could believe in and have faith in. Definitely needs to get a divorce. 3,500 likes. Somebody was saying, like what I was saying, girl, you shouldn't have got married. Like, who, when they first meet you, would call you ya and no, like use that like informal language. And there's a lot of people saying that they had similar situations with their mother-in-law. There's a lot of people on there that are like, they had similar situations like with their mom-in-law and stuff like that. And it's so sad that like, even to this day, there's still such extreme cases of that going on. But I think after this next generation, it will most likely like die out a lot. So I have faith that the next generation of parent-children relationships will be much more healthy. Korea is making a big effort to educate and teach Korean moms-in-laws. I've come across some TV shows where they literally sat down Korean mom-in-laws and they were like, okay, this is how you treat your children in marriage. And I think just overall on Korean TV shows and like talk shows, when they bring these stories on, everyone is sort of telling the mom-in-laws, you can't do that, you can't be that way. So it is changing a lot. I think people are starting to take notice of like mental health and stuff like that. And there's a lot of programs like geared toward helping people's mental health. It's still kind of taboo to talk about mental health or to say that obviously this person is not mentally healthy, they need help. So hopefully as time goes on, things will change and get better and we will have less and less of these kind of insane mom-in-law stories. There are still so many stories out there, but today I just wanted to share these two. This video is quite long already. But if there are some video topics that you want me to cover or some things that you've heard that are happening in Korea and you want me to share information about it, then let me know down below. If you know of some crazy stories that you want me to share or talk about, it doesn't necessarily have to be related to Korea and life in South Korea. I think because I'm here in Korea and you guys are interested in life in Korea, that's kind of where we can start. But I'm hoping that in the future we can just talk about more and other things, maybe even beside Korea. So let me know if there's some things that you want me to talk about or things that you wish for me to change in these type of videos. Typically my videos have a lot of editing and music and stuff. So this is new to me to sort of be doing a more podcast style video also. So if there are some things that you would like to see change in the video or some things that you would like for me to do, then just let me know, because these videos are also just sort of like a trial for me as well. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. If you like this video and you'd like to see more videos, please subscribe to my YouTube page, which is down below. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, not on Snapchat because I don't use that no more. Follow me on TikTok, like me on Facebook, and I will see ya.